She was, by nearly every account, the most graceful woman Hollywood ever produced. 2 marriages, a string of quiet heartbreaks, and a public image so polished it looked untouchable. But in the last stretch of her life, Audrey Hepburn admitted something few people saw coming. Without ceremony, she pointed to the one person she had never fully let go of. It wasn't either of her husbands. It wasn't a leading man. It was someone almost nobody would guess. And once you understand who it was, her entire story reads differently. People remember Audrey Hepburn for the little black dress, the pearls, the poise that seemed effortless. Fewer remember that she spent 14 years married to a man who left her feeling diminished. His name was Mel Ferrer. From the outside, they seemed made for each other. Sophisticated, well-read, fluent in several languages, both consumed by the arts. They were introduced through actor Gregory Peck in the early 1950s, and after being cast opposite each other in the Broadway production Undine, their off-stage chemistry became impossible to deny. By the fall of 1954, they'd married quietly in Switzerland. In the beginning, it worked. Ferrer took an active hand in guiding her career, and Audrey, still new to Hollywood, leaned on his experience. But guidance has a way of curdling into control, and that's what happened here. People around the couple noticed Ferrer weighing on nearly everything: her roles, her image, even her friendships. Audrey, one of the most recognized women alive, often found herself deferring to him completely. Underneath all of this sat a deeper ache: her longing to become a mother. It wasn't a passing wish. It was something she carried with real intensity. She miscarried for the first time in 1955. Then, in 1959, while filming The Unforgiven, she was thrown from a horse during a stunt sequence. The fall fractured her back, sent her to hospital for weeks, and ended in a second miscarriage. Grief piled on top of a marriage that was already narrowing around her. When her son Sean was finally born in 1960, it briefly felt like a turning point. She stepped away from film work for an entire year, a nearly unheard of choice for someone at her level of stardom, and gave herself over to raising him. But the marriage kept unraveling underneath. Stories about Ferrer's temper, his jealousy, and infidelity on both sides grew harder to ignore. After 14 years, they divorced. Audrey walked away exhausted, but for the first time in a long while, unbound. She had no idea the next chapter would wound her in a completely different fashion. By the late 1960s, Audrey Hepburn had reached the summit of fame. Breakfast at Tiffany's, Charade, My Fair Lady. She wasn't just an actress anymore. She was a fixture of the culture itself. And then she simply stepped away from it. Hollywood didn't understand. Studios were offering her nearly anything. Directors wanted her. Yet her reasoning was straightforward. She wanted her son Sean to have the kind of ordinary childhood she'd never had, and she felt fame was starting to take something from him she wasn't willing to sacrifice. It was around this period, during a Mediterranean cruise, that she met Andrea Dotti, an Italian psychiatrist whose warmth and ease felt like a relief after the rigidity of her first marriage. The setting practically wrote its own romance. Coastlines, open water, long unhurried evenings. Within 6 months, they were married, and Audrey relocated to Rome to try on a simpler, more private existence. For a while, it seemed to be exactly what she wanted. But Diddy had a side he'd kept hidden during those Mediterranean nights. His affairs began early and never really stopped. And they weren't subtle. Italian tabloids covered them openly, and the paparazzi who trailed Audrey for years made sure none of it stayed quiet. She had left Hollywood in search of privacy, and instead found herself in a different kind of spotlight altogether. She stayed in the marriage longer than most expected, partly for their son Luca, born in 1970, and partly because she wasn't someone who abandoned commitments easily. But eventually the repeated betrayals, combined with the complete absence of privacy, became too much. She rarely spoke publicly about the divorce once it happened. That wasn't her way, but people close to her said it left her more guarded than she'd ever been. 2 marriages, 2 very different forms of disappointment, and underneath both, a pattern that traced back much further than either man. Here's a detail most retrospectives skip past. The relationships Audrey Hepburn chose and the pain she tolerated inside them didn't begin with Ferrer or Diddy. They began in childhood. She was born in Brussels in 1929. Her early years were unsettled. Her family moved between London, Arnhem, and other cities, following her father Joseph Rustin's work. And by the time she was young, she already spoke 6 languages. On paper, it looked like a privileged, well-traveled upbringing. In reality, something far darker was unfolding. Both of her parents were open, active supporters of the Nazi movement during the 1930s, attending rallies in Germany and aligning themselves publicly with the ideology. Then, in 1935, her father left the family altogether, so consumed by fascist politics that he abandoned his wife and daughter and moved to London. Audrey was 6. That departure became the emotional wound that shaped the rest of her life, something she acknowledged herself in later years. At boarding school in Kent, she watched classmates leave for the holidays while she waited for a father who had visitation rights and simply never used them. Then came the war. Sent to the Netherlands in the belief it would be safer, 10-year-old Audrey instead found herself living through the German invasion of 1940, hiding in cellars as fighting moved through the streets above her. She took on a Dutch alias, Etta van Heemstra, to hide her English identity. In 1942, 2 of her uncles were executed by Nazi forces. After that, she stopped trying to stay invisible and joined the Dutch resistance, ferrying messages in underground newspapers, sometimes hidden in her shoes. She also kept dancing. Ballet had been her dream before the war. Now she used it to raise money in secret for the resistance, performing in rooms where applause had to be silent so as not to give anyone away. By 1944, one of the harshest winters of the war brought widespread famine to the Netherlands as German blockades cut off food. Audrey's family survived partly on tulip bulbs. Malnutrition, anemia, and respiratory illness followed. The same girl who would later become one of the most photographed faces of the century was, at that point, a starving teenager. When liberation finally arrived, a UNICEF worker handed her a chocolate bar. She remembered it for the rest of her life. Biographers and psychologists who studied her have often pointed to her father's abandonment as the key to understanding much of what came later. Her attraction to older, commanding men, her tendency to stay in relationships long after they'd stopped serving her. It wasn't naivety. It looked, in hindsight, like an unconscious search for the stability she'd lost as a child. What made it more complicated was that, decades later, she actually found him. Using the Red Cross in the 1960s, she tracked her father down living quietly in Dublin, the very country he'd relocated to not long after leaving. She approached their reunion hoping for warmth or at least acknowledgement. What she got instead was distance and indifference. And still, she forgave him. She supported him financially for the remainder of his life. That single fact, more than any role she ever played, tells you something essential about who she was. Before either marriage, there was William Holden. Their connection began on the set of Sabrina in 1954, a production already strained before filming even started. Humphrey Bogart had wanted the female lead to go to his wife, Lauren Bacall, and made his resentment toward Audrey obvious throughout the shoot. Holden, by contrast, was drawn to her instantly, and their on-screen chemistry carried over into a real relationship off-camera. For a while, it was serious enough that Holden proposed. Audrey turned him down. The reason was simple but non-negotiable. She wanted children, and Holden,